When a human place is abandoned, decay becomes an uncontrolled experiment no laboratory could predict. Roofs fail, water seeps in, and familiar walls quietly unlock gateways for hazards you will never find in untouched nature. Dense clouds of spores, aggressive bacteria, and silent, invisible toxins emerge. Across the world, entire ecosystems are rewriting themselves inside abandoned buildings, creating dangers that force even experts to stay away. But why do the risks multiply so rapidly when people disappear? And how does the invisible siege begin? Water does not wait for permission to enter. The moment a building is left untended, small breaches in the roof or gaps around windows allow rain and humidity to slip inside. Municipal officers who inspect vacant properties describe how, within weeks, a steady cycle of dampness begins. Each rainfall seeps through broken shingles or clogged gutters, pooling above ceilings and trickling into wall cavities. Even when the sky's clear, moisture lingers, trapped by the very materials meant to keep it out. Drywall swells and softens, wooden beams begin to warp, and metal fixtures quietly corrode from the inside out. In older structures, paint peels away in ribbons as plaster beneath it crumbles, releasing fine dust into the stagnant air. The building envelope, once a barrier against the elements, now traps humidity, creating pockets of condensation that never fully dry. Municipal records show that repeated wetting and drying cycles accelerate the breakdown of adhesives and sealants, further widening every crack. This constant presence of water is more than a cosmetic problem. It is the silent ignition point for a chain reaction of hazards. Corrosion eats at wiring and pipes, while swollen floors and ceilings lose their strength and threaten collapse. The air itself grows heavy with moisture, setting the stage for what comes next: the explosive growth of organisms that thrive where water stands still. Without daily ventilation, sunlight, or maintenance, these spaces become saturated not just with water, but with the promise of new dangers, each one seeded by the slow, relentless entry of moisture. Long after the last person locks the door, abandoned buildings become magnets for illegal dumping. Broken windows and unsecured doors invite more than just rain. They offer cover for people looking to offload tires, furniture, and scrap. Municipal response teams describe entering vacant houses where piles of debris fill entire rooms, blocking exits and covering stairwells. Among the trash, flammable materials, old mattresses, cardboard, even solvents accumulate unnoticed. Each new load raises the risk. A single spark from a stripped wire or a tossed cigarette can ignite weeks, even months, of hidden fuel. Firefighters report that blazes in these sites burn hotter and spread faster, feeding on the dense layers of dumped waste. In some cities, arson is not just a possibility, but a pattern. Emergency logs show repeated calls to the same addresses, where fires erupt again and again after each cleanup. The combination of debris and structural decay turns these properties into tinderboxes, threatening not only the building itself, but neighboring homes and responders. Municipal crews describe the unpredictability of these fires. Floors collapse without warning, and smoke pours from hidden cavities, making navigation nearly impossible. The physical dangers multiply with every unchecked load of trash, compounding the stress on already weakened walls and beams. Each fire leaves behind more damage, stripping away what little integrity remains and exposing new surfaces to the elements. In this way, neglect becomes self-perpetuating. The cycle of dumping and fire accelerates decay, ensuring that the risks do not fade with time, but grow more severe with every season of abandonment. Ownership of abandoned buildings rarely follows a straight line. Titles pass from one absentee owner to another, sometimes lost in a tangle of foreclosure paperwork or disputed inheritance. Code enforcement officers describe the frustration of arriving at a site only to find no clear contact, no responsible party to address the mounting hazards. Properties left in legal limbo often fall through the cracks of municipal oversight, with inspection requests piling up faster than staff can respond. In cities facing waves of abandonment, backlogs stretch for months. Officers recount entire neighborhoods where dozens of addresses remain uninspected, not by choice, but by sheer administrative overload. Each missing inspection allows water, debris, and decay to advance unchecked. Community-led inventories have tried to fill these gaps, mapping hazards house by house when official records fall short. In Puerto Rico, after Hurricane Maria, volunteers documented dozens of sites with suspected toxic chemicals, oil spills, or unauthorized animal occupation, far surpassing what government agencies had recorded. These efforts reveal how fragmented oversight leaves multi-hazard properties invisible to the very systems meant to protect public health. Jurisdictional boundaries add another layer of confusion. A single abandoned lot might straddle city and county lines, or sit on land still tied up in bankruptcy court. Code enforcement officers face policy barriers that prevent swift action, requiring lengthy notifications, court approvals, or coordination across departments. Each procedural delay gives physical processes more time to erode what remains. The result is a landscape of neglect shaped as much by paperwork and policy as by rain and rot. Where ownership is unclear and inspections are delayed, the slow unraveling of the built environment continues, unchecked and largely unseen. Inside a sealed building, the air transforms. With each day of unchecked moisture, spores begin to accumulate at levels rarely seen outdoors. Fungi such as Aspergillus and Penicillium, invisible to the naked eye, colonize damp drywall, insulation, and wood. Their hyphae spread through wall cavities and underfloors, feeding on the cellulose of wallpaper and the starches in adhesives. In these stagnant interiors, spores do not disperse as they would in open air. Instead, they concentrate, suspended in stillness, ready to be stirred by even the slightest movement. Studies of abandoned properties reveal that spore counts can reach hundreds of thousands per cubic meter, far exceeding what is found in occupied spaces. This dense cloud of spores is not just a marker of decay. Many fungi produce mycotoxins, chemical defenses released into the air or left behind on surfaces. Inhaling these particles is linked to a range of health effects, from mild irritation to severe respiratory distress. Public health researchers have documented cases where entering a mold-infested site triggers coughing, headaches, or acute lung inflammation, especially in people with asthma or weakened immune systems. Unlike visible mold patches on walls, mycotoxins and spores are often undetectable without specialized equipment, making the risk invisible and unpredictable. The mechanics of spore aerosolization add another layer of hazard. When a door is opened or debris is disturbed, millions of spores can be released in a single burst. Without ventilation, these particles linger, settling onto every surface and remaining viable for months. Mycologists warn that even brief exposure in such environments can overwhelm the body's natural defenses. In abandoned hospitals and schools, air samples have revealed a complex mix of fungal species, some capable of producing toxins that persist long after the initial growth has faded. These conditions, high spore density, stagnant air, and potent mycotoxins, create a biological hazard unique to abandoned structures, and they set the stage for further microbial threats that follow wherever water stands still. Beneath every abandoned building, the plumbing system quietly transforms. Water that once flowed daily now sits motionless in pipes and tanks, creating a perfect breeding ground for bacteria. Within 3 days of stagnation, the total bacterial count in a typical building's water system reaches a stationary phase, a plateau where growth stabilizes, but the population remains dense. Among these microbes, Legionella bacteria find their niche. It takes about 12 days for Legionella to reach its peak concentration in stagnant water, forming colonies that thrive in the absence of disinfectant and movement. Most of these bacteria do not float freely. Over 90% embed themselves in biofilms, thin, sticky layers that line the interior of pipes and fixtures. These biofilms act as fortresses, shielding bacteria from both chemical treatments and temperature changes. Even after a building is reopened and water is flushed through the system, the majority of pathogens remain untouched, anchored deep within these microbial mats. Standard remediation techniques, such as hyperchlorination or heat flushing, often fail to penetrate the biofilm, leaving Legionella populations largely intact. In some cases, aggressive disinfection can even damage plumbing, accelerating corrosion and releasing additional nutrients that feed bacterial growth. A water microbiologist explains that the biofilm's resilience comes from its structure. Cells are embedded in a matrix of polysaccharides and proteins, which not only protect against external threats, but also foster the exchange of genetic material, including antibiotic resistance. This means that abandoned plumbing does not simply harbor old threats. It can become a laboratory for new ones. As water sits undisturbed, biofilms thicken and diversify, providing a stable home for a range of pathogens. The result is a hidden reservoir of disease, invisible to the naked eye, but ready to disperse the moment taps are turned or pipes are disturbed. In the silence of abandonment, the water system becomes a living archive of every microbe that has ever passed through, sealed away until the next intrusion. Animals do not wait for an invitation. Once people leave, the boundaries that kept wildlife out begin to dissolve. Urban ecologists tracking post-disaster sites describe how rodents, raccoons, and stray cats quickly occupy abandoned buildings, exploiting every floor and crawl space. In Puerto Rico, after Hurricane Maria, community inventories recorded 84 cases of unauthorized animal presence in vacant structures. These were not isolated incidents, but part of a pattern seen across cities and disaster zones alike. Rodents are often the first to move in, drawn by shelter and the promise of leftover food scraps or organic debris. In the absence of daily disturbance, they flourish. Their movements change too. Without people to drive them underground, rats and mice begin to explore higher floors, using collapsed ceilings and broken stairwells as vertical highways. This behavior is rare in the wild, but common in abandoned architecture, where the usual predators are absent and the risks of exposure are minimal. Mesopredators, animals like raccoons and opossums, follow, finding new nesting sites in attics or behind false walls. Urban ecologists note that these animals adapt quickly to the artificial environment, sometimes learning to open doors or pry loose panels in search of food. Their presence is not just a curiosity. Bite incidents rise, especially when animals become trapped or cornered inside. In some cases, emergency responders have reported injuries sustained while removing animals from blocked stairwells or collapsed basements. The damage goes beyond the occasional encounter. Rodents gnaw through wiring and insulation, accelerating the decay of already compromised systems. Their droppings and nesting materials clog drains and air ducts, while their constant movement spreads debris and disease throughout the structure. Over time, the physical impact of animal occupation compounds the hazards left by water and neglect. As the building's defenses crumble, animals become both symptom and agent of decay. setting the stage for hazards that are chemical as well as biological. Chemical hazards in abandoned places do not fade with time. They persist, hidden in the walls, floors, and soil long after people have left. Asbestos, once praised for its fire resistance, lingers in old insulation and ceiling tiles. When buildings decay, even minor disturbances such as wind, animals, or collapsing plaster can send microscopic fibers drifting through the air. These fibers, invisible and weightless, settle deep into the lungs when inhaled, causing diseases that may not appear for decades. Heavy metals follow a different path. Lead-based paint, common before 1978, flakes from walls and window frames, mixing with household dust. Rainwater trickling through cracks leaches these particles into the soil below, where they accumulate season after season. In former industrial sites, tanks and pipes corrode, releasing cadmium, mercury, and arsenic. Each rainfall carries these metals further, sometimes contaminating groundwater or nearby streams. Synthetic chemicals add another layer. Polychlorinated biphenyls, known as PCBs, linger in electrical equipment and caulking, while dioxins remain in ash pits from hospital incinerators. Organophosphates leaking from forgotten agricultural tanks seep into the ground, creating dead zones where even soil microbes struggle to survive. Community inventories in Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria documented 67 cases of suspected toxic chemicals and 73 oil spills in abandoned lots, numbers that hint at the scale of invisible contamination. A remediation contractor describes entering these sites with caution, knowing that each step may disturb a legacy of toxins. Protective suits and respirators become standard gear, not for what can be seen, but for what remains suspended in dust and soil. In these places, the danger is not always obvious. It is woven into the fabric of the building, carried by wind and water, and left behind by decades of human activity. Access to abandoned places is often controlled not by scientists or public health officials, but by a complex web of legal and administrative barriers. City environmental attorneys describe a landscape where liability is rarely clear. When a vacant building becomes hazardous, the question of who is responsible, absentee owner, bank, or municipality, can stall any meaningful intervention. Insurance policies may exclude coverage for contamination or injury, leaving all parties exposed to unpredictable costs. Municipal budgets, already stretched thin by waves of vacancy, rarely allow for comprehensive testing or remediation. Instead, local governments prioritize containment, sealing doors and windows, fencing off lots, and posting warning signs, hoping to limit exposure without incurring full cleanup obligations. Scientific research often stops at the threshold. Entry to these sites requires legal clearance, environmental waivers, and sometimes court orders. Even when hazards are well documented, the risk of spreading contamination or triggering a structural collapse deters direct study. As a result, many abandoned places remain unexamined, their dangers inferred rather than measured. In Philadelphia, a randomized controlled trial found that simply sealing vacant lots and maintaining their boundaries led to a measurable reduction in gun violence. Yet, such interventions are exceptions. Most sites remain in a holding pattern, locked away behind legal and financial barriers. The promise of remediation is weighed against the reality of limited resources and uncertain outcomes. In this impasse, the risks persist, contained more by paperwork than by any real solution. Even now, abandoned sites quietly breed hazards beyond nature's design, including drug-resistant pathogens, chemical seepage, and new disease reservoirs. As urban spaces empty at unprecedented rates, these invisible risks persist. unchecked and evolving. The boundary between controlled safety and toxic chaos is thinner than we imagine. In the end, neglect is never neutral. It rewrites the world in ways we can't always see. Share your thoughts below.